Samuel and chapter 25. We've been looking these past Sunday evenings together at the life of David. At this early stage in his life, we found him coming from obscurity in the fields and hills of Bethlehem right into the valley of Elah, where there he defeated Goliath and was launched into superstardom and celebrity, fame. He had position, status, and it all happened so quickly for David. And following his life through, it's been really insightful, though I do feel that we've run our course here and we'll move on perhaps after next week. But it would be amiss to do so, having followed him through so far and seen him to be such a paragon of virtue and restraint and graciousness. And that's not what we find here in chapter 25. And so we're going to look at that this evening. And what we find is provocation. Real, open provocation, where David is referred to as someone on the run. Verse 10, Nabal said to David's servant, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse?" And so in a dismissive, arrogant way, David is utterly rejected. And the shame of that rejection brings in him a quite unfortunate response. It's a very interesting chapter. But it's interesting in many ways, of course, because of David at its centre. But since he's been forced to go on the run from Saul, we've seen him having to deal with almost unrelenting pressure. He's dealt with being driven from his home. His wife has been lost to him. His family initially lost to him. He was a refugee, an exile. He was unarmed on the run. Saul was hunting him like a dog. And now, and from there, we've seen him dealing with threat and bitter, undeserved harassment. And he's dealt with it incredibly well for a young man. And he was a young man. And we see something of his character, his faith, his utter dependence on the Lord. And then here in Carmel, things suddenly and unexpectedly change for us, the readers of this young man's life. The wilderness years, as they're called, have been testing times for David. But we've seen him during the testing times growing in his dependence on the Lord. And in this way, we've seen him being prepared by Israel's God to be the leader of Israel's people. And we've seen this process of growth and faith and dependence. And while the text gives us quite tremendous insight, the Psalms historically that are linked to this period, 34 and 55 and 56, 57, 142, they give us glimpses into his heart. And there we find someone dealing with pressure. He wasn't some kind of robot. He wasn't some superhero. He wasn't someone who was spotless and sinless. Only Christ is without sin, this we know. But maybe that's why this chapter comes as such a shock, as we've read through and seen such consistency and faithfulness. That last week we looked in chapter 24 where David and his young men, he probably had a bodyguard with him or a scouting party, and they're hiding in a cave, and Saul, of all caves, of all the places, comes in. He parks there with 3,000 of Israel's best around him, lies asleep in the cave, and David's young men, he's here. Take his life, take the crown. God has given you this moment. And David showed courageous restraint and blocked his men's attempts to kill the king and said he would not lift his hand against the Lord's anointed. And so we looked at that and saw David there. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. This courageous restraint. But it seems as we come into chapter 25, the courageous restraint is burnt out. Gone, the brakes are off. David, in looking at Saul, has seen the Lord's anointed and would not lift his hand against him, despite the horrendous and unjust harassment and persecution that he suffered at his hands. He would not lift his hand against the Lord's anointed. Yet this man, with an arrogant dismissal of David's servants, brings out in David wrath and anger, as we have not seen before. When David's young men came, they said all this to Nabal in the name of David, and then they waited. And Nabal answered, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse?" David, verse 13, is told of this. Every man strap on his sword. Every man of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword. And with 400 men, he is like an Exocet missile coming straight towards Nabal's household. Things do not look good. And that's then the first thing. Provocation. For some time, David has been in the region of Carmel, and he has sent his men out unasked in a gesture of graciousness and neighbourliness. He's allowed his young men to protect the huge herds and flocks that belong to this man, Nabal. And the young men are witnesses to this. David's men, armed, have in effect been security for the servants of Nabal and all his flocks, which is the source of his wealth. Because as the lambs are born and the baby goats are born and the shearing, and so they're sold and the coffers are just overloaded. This is this man's well-being, his business, and David is protecting it for him. He's getting free labour, and Nabal likes that. He couldn't care less who's protecting it as long as the money keeps flowing. And that's what we find here in Nabal. The man was very rich, verse 2. He had 3,000 sheep, 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. And the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. He had descended from Caleb, one of the faithful spies. But he wasn't living up to his ancestors' faithfulness. This man's character is completely ruined and given over to selfishness. And where do we see that? Alive and well in King Saul. He was pursuing David to within an inch of his life. David then has sent his men out and allowed them to provide security for this man's flocks. At the time of shearing, as was custom of the day, David rightfully expected some form of appreciation for the consideration he had shown. So David is simply anticipating consideration. But what he gets is contempt. Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? The only other person who's referred to David as the son of Jesse is Saul. And it's a derogatory term. He wouldn't even use his name. The son of Jesse. Oh, I've heard all about him. He knows all about him. There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their master. Who is this guy? Who's this insignificant individual? And what's interesting here is that David himself in the previous chapter, when he's speaking to King Saul, refers to himself as a dead dog and a flea. So David there, speaking to Saul, the man who's persecuted him and caused such grief in his life, David acknowledges before you, Saul, I'm just a dead dog, I'm a flea. Courageous restraint in place. But here, sometime later, with no restraint in place, with the brakes off, David loses the plot. David is provoked. And the scene is now set for failure and disaster. Why? Because the provocation was unexpected, undeserved, unjust. What can we say about this tonight? We can certainly say this. Provocation is an extremely damaging weapon, and it's one that the devil will use constantly in attacking and disrupting the Church of Jesus Christ. If he can break down relationships and end friendships, undermine and attack fellowship through provocation, one of his fiery darts, he will do so without hesitation. And we're better to launch this attack than from a selfish heart. And Nabal is wide open to be the devil's instrument here. Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? There are many servants these days breaking away. Shall I give my bread and my water and my meat that I've killed for my shearers? And then we read on down here that where one of the young men, having seen what's about to happen, goes to Abigail. Thankfully, Abigail is here. David says that, in verse 14, he says to Abigail, our master railed at them. And that's a word, that word there, veiled, it's at its, in its root meaning, there's a hysteria. There's like something frantic. It's as if the pictures that he's screaming and shouting at them. And it's as if he's seeing some of his wealth. He's sitting on his fortune and his riches. And he's seeing these unrecognized young men standing before him saying, maybe you'd like to donate to David for protecting and helping you build up your wealth. And such is his obsession with himself and his wealth and his money, utterly loses the plot, and he's like a shrieking maniac to the young men and sends them away. That's the picture of the language here. And so Nabal is very clearly a nasty piece of work. He's someone who's utterly self-obsessed and focused on nothing but his money and his wealth. And we find him later in the chapter full of drink, not caring about anything but himself. He's happy to take, but not to give. Outwardly, here's a man who had everything, but inwardly it was very different. His heart was in the wrong place. His priorities were on his wealth. He was harsh, he was selfish, he was a grabber, he was demanding, he was dishonest. It's all laid out before us here. Nabal was a nasty piece of work. So we take lessons from this. Did David know the kind of man he was dealing with? We don't know. But as was custom of the time, David said in verse 6, "Thus go up to Carmel, go to Nabal, greet him in my name. Peace be to you, peace be to your house, peace be to all that you have." So David is not coming in here aggressive, kicking in doors and looking for money that doesn't belong to him. He's looking for simple recompense for the decent care he has given, and what he gets instead is contempt. So there's provocation here. And that'll just bring us straight on in chapter 25, secondly, to a wrong reaction, and then we'll look, as time allows us tonight, at a right reaction. David then, a wrong reaction. His reaction to Nabal, to say the least, is nuclear charged. Verse 13, "Men, get your swords." It wasn't get your sticks, it wasn't grab your horses, let's go and have a word with this guy. It was straight to swords. It was DEFCON 1. Here then is David's reaction. It is utterly explosive. Every man of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword. And with 400 men armed, they are charging straight to Nabal's place. And we know his heart because it's revealed to us later on that David had said in verse 21, "In vain have I guarded all this fellow has in the wilderness, so nothing was missed of all that belonged to him. He has returned me evil for good." He's protected his wealth. He's kept his men safe. He's kept his flocks from being stolen or plundered. God do so to the enemies of David and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. David's not going here to put him right. David's going here to kill. He's going in here to kill every one male that could be linked or belong to this man Nabal because of the slight that he has been given at his hand. He has seen sneering indifference and he's lost the plot. But this explosion, this anger, it sets him headfirst towards failure. Now we can say this very clearly. It's not a sin to be angry, but it's hard not to sin when we are angry. And this is where this chapter takes us. It's not a sin to be angry. We don't point the finger at David. We don't step back in righteous indignation and say, "Oh, anger." It's a righteous anger. He's been treated with utter disrespect and contempt. But it's hard not to sin when we're angry. Isn't that right, Christian friends? And what we can see here is that his rage took the place of his ability to reason things out. It seems that his rage took the place of David pressing pause. We've seen the switch where in previous chapter 23 and 24 where we saw David being driven before Saul, then we saw David switch to being guided by God. Bring the ephod here. David sought the Lord in prayer. He had at this stage the service of a priest and a prophet. We don't read of them. They're not even considered. They're not brought into David's command circle. He doesn't talk. It's get your swords. The rage has come down. The blinkers are on. The red mist just descends. And we can see David on his way to Nabal's camp. And he is driven there not by faith. It's frustration that's driving him. It's frustration. His decision-making then in that moment has been changed. He's not waiting patiently upon the Lord. That's what's kept him right up until now. Now everything changes. In vain have I guarded all this fellow has in the wilderness. And this fellow has been, as the young man said, he railed at him. Yet the men were very good to us, and we suffered no harm, and we did not miss anything when we were in the fields, as long as we went with them. In verse 15, they were a wall to us by night and by day. Now therefore know this, and consider that you would do, for harm is determined against our master and against all this house, and he is such a worthless man that one cannot speak to him. His household knew. There's no point. This young man, this very wise young man, knew that disaster was coming. They sensed it. They saw that David being treated with such contempt could cause disaster, and indeed that's exactly what has happened. David's men are inbound now. So Abigail made haste. Everything's at a pace from verse 18 onwards. There's no hanging about. She too senses the danger. She senses the atmospherics. She knows something's changed, the dynamics of what her husband has done. And so she gets on with things. She gets together a train of donkeys laden with provision in acceptance and acknowledgement of David's service, and she starts on her way to meet him. So what can we say about this then at the moment? Well, we're kidding ourselves if we think we're at our best when we're angry. That's for sure. We're kidding ourselves if we think we're at our best when we're angry. This is how one very wise writer put it. Anger is a wind which blows out the lamp of the mind. Anger is a wind which blows out the lamp of the mind. Wise words. This reaction in anger has committed David to a course of action that as he's going to put blood on his hands and slaughter the innocents around Nabal because of this wicked, despicable man's actions toward him. David's pride, it would seem, has relegated God's honour, and that left him wide open to sin. And it all comes from the provocation of this wicked man. The man who would be king over Israel is head first bound in here on a mission of revenge. Not good. Perhaps summed up best this way. People who fly into a rage always make a bad landing. People who fly into a rage always make a bad landing. If David and his 400 arrive at this camp, there's going to be blood and mayhem and death. What then? There's a bad reaction here. But there's also, thankfully, a right reaction. And for that, it's not the king of Israel. It's not the boy who would be king. It's Abigail. Abigail, we're told only of her here as we're introduced to the characters. She was a woman. She was discerning. She was very wise and beautiful. But the man was harsh and badly behaved. And in Abigail's conduct and in her speech, I wonder if there's a more dignified speech recorded for us in the pages of Scripture. As Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David in her face and bowed to the ground. So there's her posture. But it's what she says. It's just magnificent. On me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears. Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. It's a play on the language here where Nabal, and a lot of writers think, well, not really sure what these opening the words are getting at, because Nabal, it would seem, actually means noble. But then there's other courses, schools of thought that say, well, it means fool. But then that would mean that if it means fool, that this boy, when he was born, was named the fool by his parents, which does seem unlikely. This seems to be more likely a play on the sounding of the words, where Nabal in the ancient Hebrew sounded the same as the word for fool. And so we have Abigail here saying, here, and let not my lord Nabal, for as his name is, so he is. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my lord whom you sent. See there right away? If Abigail had seen these young men arriving, she would have dealt with them entirely differently, and recompense would have been given, no issue. Now then, my lord, as the Lord lives, as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand, now then let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my lord be as Nabal. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my lord be given to the young men who follow my lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my lord a sure house, because my lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. David's loss of self-control is utterly contrasted here with Abigail's wisdom, discernment, patience, and grace. And she exercises it. Unlike Nabal, she was thoughtful, compassionate, approachful, and wise. In many ways the opposite of the guy that she'd married. And sensing the danger of the situation, she thought how best to deal with it. And in so doing, revealed a grasp of the bigger picture. She appealed to David's character, conscious of his standing. My Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord. She's almost saying to him, what are you doing? Why are you coming here to slaughter and kill because of this man, this worthless man, this fool who I'm married to? You're the potential, you're the next king of Israel. If men rise up to pursue you and seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living, in the care of the Lord your God, and the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the hollow of a sling. And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord working salvation himself. What wisdom, grace, and faith in these words. She said, David, if you pass me, you're going to regret it for the rest of your life. You're fighting the Lord's battles. You've been raised up by the Lord, fighting for the Lord's people. If men rise up to pursue you, you will be bound in the bundle of the living. Isn't that wonderful? What the language there in verse 29. But your enemies, they'll be as in the hollow of the sling, David's favoured personal weapon as a youngster. And when the Lord has done to you and made you prince over Israel, she knew. She knew the turmoil between Saul and David. It had spread. The news was out. Saul was after the man who had what? Been appointed by Samuel. He will be our next prince. Yes. My Lord, you shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause. And there's the rub. David was coming to seek vengeance for a slight, and was prepared to slaughter all the men in Nabal's camp. She reminded him of his standing. She reminded him of his status, and said, David, if you go ahead, you will only have bitter regret all your life. David then is too blinkered to look ahead and see the consequences of his actions, and the Lord brings Abigail to set him right. She's a wonderful character. We know at the end of the chapter that she marries David as Nabal dies, when it seems his conscience is opened. He is struck dumb with what he's heard, that David was coming and that Abigail had saved the entire household, and all the male people in the house had been spared because of her actions. Nabal dies a broken man, and David marries Abigail. They go on to have children together. And we just need to remember something of the wisdom of his words. When the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, this character, their standing, their status, Christian friend, in the Lord's name we bear these things. We are the Lord's. You are my people. I will be your God. And so tonight we remember, through Abigail's wise words, through her graciousness, this. There are 3 testaments open tonight to Leith. We know this. The Old Testament, the New Testament, the New Testament. Which one are people going to read first? It's us, isn't it? People who don't read the Bible today are going to read you and me. They're going to listen. They're going to watch. They're going to observe. Why? Because they see in our conduct, our bearing, our conversation, the fact that we're regular churchgoers, that God matters to us. And so they're going to read us and assess us. And going to start asking questions and drawing conclusions from what they see and what they hear. This we know. And so we can take that from here. A lesson learned. And we don't have time to go through it now, but just bear in mind, perhaps when you have time to read through the end of this chapter, David said to Abigail, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me." It's as if David, the red mist, is blown away and he realizes, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you. You have kept me this day from blood guilt, from working salvation with my own hand." What had David been saying up to this point? I'm in the Lord's hand and in the Lord's care. He will deal with me. There David is saying, I will deal with this guy. I'm going to take over. It's all about me. Well, there's much more to be said, but we're not going to spend any more time because you've given me a lot of time to look at this this chapter and this part of David's life, which is so intriguing in many ways, how he deals with this consistent pressure. But what we see here in effect is this, that the Lord rescues David from his own stupidity, from his own sense of grandeur, from the sense of the slight that must have in some way needled his pride, in a way that Saul, having driven him up almost to despair at this point, you'd think he could have dealt with this. But because he didn't, what we can see here in chapter 25 is the Lord's preventative providence. Preventative providence. Where this gracious, discerning, beautiful girl Abigail comes to this boy who would be king, armed to the teeth, a warrior, a prince and a general, a man who had learned the art of warcraft and knew what it was to stand on the battlefield and feel vulnerable as being made of paper. He knew what it was to put his life on the line. He'd faced down Goliath. And here was this great man about to make a great error of judgment, being stopped in his tracks by Abigail. He says, what are you doing? Passing here leaves only guilt. And David immediately recognizes, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Abigail then warns us. She warns us away from being inconsistent. She advises us and guides us in this wonderful speech, this magnificent way she speaks to David, to be consistent, be prayerful, be the person the Lord wants you to be this week. Don't allow rashness or anger or provocation or something else to come in and blow you off course. We're kidding ourselves if we think we're at our best when we're angry. And let us not let the wind of anger blow out the lamp of our mind that tells us that we are the Lord's and He is ours, and there is a manner and a conduct and a bearing that we're called to. May He bless us as we seek to be the open testament we're called to be this week. And may He give us the grace of Abigail to deal with situations as they emerge. We'll bow in prayer for a moment. Lord, bless us tonight, we pray. We thank you for your goodness, your mercy. We thank you for your love, and above all for Jesus Christ. We pray, Lord, that Abigail's conduct would encourage us and nourish us this evening going into a new week. That we would see, Lord, that even the best are men at best. That David's reaction was wrong. and being driven by forces beyond one of prayer and faith. We see him making headlong into disaster and failure. Lord, keep us, we pray. Keep us from anger and provocation. Grant us, Lord, to be the people you would have us to be. We would seek to give you the glory in every way. And ask, Lord, for your blessing tonight. For Jesus' sake. Amen. Well, we'll close our service.